My name is Johan, and I will be your host for the next 75 minutes. Just before we start, I just want to make sure that I have asked them to lower the temperature in the room a few more degrees so that you really get, stay awake the entire after lunch hour. No, actually I did quite the opposite. I asked them to increase it because when it's cold up here with the lights coming on, I know it's even colder down there. So hopefully they will do that soon for you. My usual disclaimer, this is a technical session. I would say that the level is 367 because I tend to pend a little bit between 300 and 400, but I had to select one of them, so I selected 400. Meaning, if you don't like command prompts, if you don't like scripts, if you don't like log files, you probably won't like this session. So if you got here by accident and thought this was like a level 100 overview of Windows 7, I will certainly not be offended if you go and saw another session that sort of meet your expectations even more. So, I have been an IT guy since I was about 10. Started to do deployment when I was about 16 and have doing that ever since. So now making it into year 21 of doing deployments. It was easier back then. Copying 2 floppies, done. That was deployment. As usual, we have a specific Twitter feed for this session. And I love questions, so if you have any, just raise your hand and I will answer them. But you can also send in questions using Twitter, and I'm monitoring this channel right here, right now. And I just got a question about any Mumford & Sons on that playlist. No, unfortunately not. I did not have that. I guess it's referring to the music list here. So feel free to send me any email, the Twitter feeds during the session here, and I will try to keep track of them. So, as you can hear from my accent, I'm not a native American. I live in Europe, in Sweden, but I travel quite a bit, so I'm in the US about once a month. So it almost feels like home here. This session is about understanding what's going on behind the scenes and how we can be effective when troubleshooting setup that fails. Why device drivers are not being injected as they're supposed to be, where can we find the log files, how can we understand component-based servicing, where can we find more information if needed, things like that. So again, a highly technical session. So I have a demo environment for you. I have a quite nice laptop running actually dual solid-state drives, 256. And 16 gigs of RAM, and I'm running Hyper-V, and I have a bunch of VMs. But this setup allows me to run up to 10 VMs on a single laptop, running on battery on an airplane for about 20 minutes. Then the battery dies. We have one domain controller up and running all the time, and then we will bounce back and forth between a few member servers that will act as our file servers when we do deployment. And then I have a few clients as well. So, Windows 7 setup itself. First of all, there is 2 different setups. We have one for 32-bit setups, and we have one for 64-bit setups. So you need to be on the right architecture to execute the right architecture of the setup. So if I want to execute or start the 32-bit setup, I need to be in 32-bit WinPE. And if I want to start a 64-bit setup, I need to be in 64-bit WinPE. Now, and as I will show you in the demo, you can do cross-platform deployment because I can actually call the 32-bit setup and ask for a 64-bit image. However, most deployment tools doesn't support that yet. For example, MDT 2010 does block that right now, but in the 2012 version, they are actually adding in cross-platform support so that you don't need to have multiple boot images, which is sort of nice. It's simply easier to maintain one boot image than 2. As most of you know, the setup itself is automated using the unattended XML file. I mean, in the XP days, we used to have a bunch of answer files. We used to have unattended text for scripted setups. We used to have sysprev INF for resealing processes and for the mini setup. We used to have WinBob INI for Windows PE, older versions. Now they are all merged together in a single unattended XML file, but we have different sections in that file. So you need to know where you are injecting changes because setup will use different sections during different passes of the overall setup. Then in the nicer editions of Windows 7, we have boot from VHD, which is truly awesome. What it means is that you create a single file, a VHD container, and you can create that using diskpart or disk manager, and then you take your image and apply to that VHD, and then you detach it. So now you have the entire stuff in a VHD file. So the VHD file is being interpreted by the OS as a hard drive, a virtual hard drive still, but still a hard drive, a block-level device. I can now take that file, go to a client with a blank hard drive, copy that file only to that hard drive, so when I do a directory listing, I only see that file, change the bootloader, and now I can boot on that file. But it's only available in Enterprise and Ultimate versions of Windows 7. This takes dual booting to a whole new level, because I can now have 3, 4, 5 VHD files side by side on the drive and simply select which one I like to boot for now. And this is really useful when, say you want to test the service pack. You have Windows 7 RTM running, create the VHD file, copy over your image, add a boot entry, boot into that VHD, test the service pack because you are testing on the real hardware. We are not running virtual, we are just using the virtual disk. And then when we're done testing, we can simply delete the file. Pretty cool. In the XP days, we had to deal with all sorts of HAL replacement and things to get support to have a single image supporting all the hardware that we have. And that was really not supported by Microsoft. And just going between Intel CPUs and AMD CPUs, we had to do different tricks to get that work. No need anymore. Windows 7 will, during boot, figuring out these things for you. So life is much easier now. Even drivers, much easier now, but I hate to break it to you. Driver problems did not go away with Windows 7. They did not. It's just that we have better tools now to manage them. So life is easier. And we use WinPE3 to drive the deployment. It's simply, that's the requirement to deploy Windows 7. All right. So people starting to deploy Windows 7 quickly realize that the image that you use, because everything is image-based now, is slightly larger than it used to be. Because an XP image without the installation file is about half gig in size. A clean 32-bit image, close to about 2 gigs. A 64-bit image, almost 3 gigs in size, or 2.57 if you look at the actual media there. All right. So what if we have a distributed environment? What if I have a branch office down here and a central site over here? Well, say I have a 4 megabit line in between. In the XP days, I could probably deploy a client, if needed, over the WAN line from a central deployment server because the image was really small. Wasn't optimal, but I could do it. Now, when the images are starting to get 3, 4, 5 gigs in size, that's not going to happen. So most organizations, either you upgrade the WAN link, but that's costly. So normally you start to stage content now closer to the clients. So you will see more file servers at the branch office. You will see clients acting as file servers at the branch office for other clients. We see usage of different WAN accelerators, buses, Cisco's, things like that, cache content providers. So when we pull the content, we always pull it from a local source rather than pulling it over the wire. Then in Windows 7, we have 2 folders, beginning with the letter R on a default installation. If you take the Windows 7 DVD, pop it in, blindfold you, and enter, finish, you have 2 folders when that setup is complete, beginning with R. What are they? Surprise for a correct answer. Recovery is one of them. Recycle bin is the other. I will give this one for the recovery folder because that's normally what people are missing. Who answered recovery? You, sir? Thanks. So recovery, yes. What's in the recovery folder? Files, yeah. WinRE is in that folder. Correct. The recovery environment. Meaning if Windows 7 for some reason fails to boot, guess what? It will fail over to the recovery environment. And it will do up to 20 different tests of your machines trying to repair it if possible. And if you want to, you can actually extend this environment and add your own stuff to it as well. That's typically what you see if you go down and buy a OEM machine like a Dell, Lenovo, HP, and they normally add in their own recovery stuff to the hard drive as well. So that is being changing. Also, most of what I'm saying, basically this session is about the differences from XP to Windows 7. Some of it happened to be valid for Vista as well, but since most companies sort of skip that step, it's purely by accident. I did not mean to, but it is valid also for Windows Vista. In Vista and above, in Windows 7, we have offline servicing, meaning we can simply open the image on the server, inject patches, drivers, language packs, and close it. How would we do that for an XP image? What if you have an XP image and it's Patch Tuesday from Microsoft and there is like 10 more patches that needs to go inside that image? How do you get them inside that image? Yeah, you rebuild it. Yeah, exactly. You take the image, you dump it to a VM, you install the patches, you sysprep it, and you capture it, and you do that again every month. But now we can do a 30-second operation rather than doing a 30-minute operation. In future Microsoft products, like Config Manager 2012, they are now adding this to the UI. So we can just right-click an image and say, hey, update me. And they will pull the patches from the local software update point without the need to do a build and capture process, which is still what we do today. All right. Then in Windows 7, we have, again, the nicer additions. We have BitLocker. From a deployment point of view, what are the 2 requirements for BitLocker? TPM, yes? Exactly, and multiple partitions. So, what's the problem with the TPM chipset? Well, the specification says basically a recommendation to the vendors that TPM should be disabled by default. So if you buy a machine, it normally comes with TPM disabled, and there is no password in BIOS. And for BitLocker to work, we need to have both. So we need to have a lengthy password in BIOS, often 8 characters or more, depending on vendor, and we need to have the TPM chipset enabled. So now we may run into the license costs of BitLocker. What are the license costs for BitLocker, or can be? Yes, sir. Exactly. A nice pair of runner shoes that you give to the newest hired employee and tell him, her to go ahead and run and into BIOS on every single machine. Set a password and enable TPM. Or could it possibly be that we can actually do this as part of our deployment solution? The answer is, it depends. If you buy machines from the big guys, Dell, HP, Lenovo, they have utilities that allow you to set these things as part of your normal sequence. If you're buying machines from the guy at the corner and they were dirt cheap, he might not have those tools for those machines. So it depends a little bit. But you can, if you have these tools accessible, you can save a pair of runner shoes and instead simply enable that when you deploy these machines. What about the partitioning? How does Windows 7 partition the drive by default? Exactly. Let me try to demonstrate my extreme MS Paint skills. Don't laugh, please. This is what the drive looks like. We have a 100 meg partition in the beginning, and the other volume is for Windows write. So it will put the loader on the first partition, and then it will have Windows on the other one. And when you enable BitLocker, it's the second volume, the entire volume that's encrypted. Now, if you are using, how many people are using MDT for deployments? A few of you. How many are using Config Manager? About the rest. When you deployments using either of those solutions, and especially if you integrate them sort of together, the disks will be laid out a bit differently. It will be laid out like this. So they will put a 300 meg partition in the end, and now Windows will be on this guy over here. Why do they do this? Recoverage, and especially refresh scenarios. Because when people start to deploy, even back in the Vista days, when they started to do refresh, meaning reinstallation of the machines, they normally told their deployment solution to take the image and dump it to disk 0, partition number 1, which is the first partition. And you don't need to go to like a higher university to realize it's difficult to take a 5 gig image and try to fit it on a 100 meg partition. So the deployments stopped. They broke down completely. So that's why these guys decided we put it in the end instead to avoid these problems. But now it leads to another problem. I can't extend this volume anymore. So my question to you, how often do you do that? How often when you deploy your clients, do you only partition part of the hard drive so that you in the future can extend it? Doesn't happen, right?
More often now with virtual machines.
Exactly. VDI solutions. You buy 40 gigs of SAN from the storage group, and SAN space is expensive, so you buy what you need now. You can certainly use different technologies to extend it later. You can do that from WinP, but the comment was there are third-party utilities, even open source, that allows you to move around these guys. But I'm coming to a point here. For virtual machines, can we use BitLocker? No, we cannot. We can do it on a virtual host, thumbs up, but we cannot BitLocker encrypt the VMs. And if you can't encrypt the VMs anyway, what's the point of having that partition? No point at all. So my recommendation is simply, when creating these solutions, configure them to have physical machines, 2 partitions, virtual machines, no partition. And this is extremely difficult to configure because you need to add a single line to the deployment solutions. You detect if it's a VM, you add this line. For physical, you don't have this line, and the problem goes away. Now, to confuse everybody, in 2012 versions of the product, they will be released this fall, they are changing back again to the first layout. But they are now adding code to prevent the wrong image from being deployed to the wrong partition, something that didn't have time for in the 2010 release. So hopefully everything goes away in terms of problem, but this is what we have to deal with right now. All right. Let's jump over to the demo environment and start a normal Windows 7 setup. So I will take a client here, jump to a clean snapshot, start it, and mount a Windows 7 DVD or a Windows 7 ISO. Here we go, a 7 Enterprise ISO, and I will start it. It's been hiding. You see it's starting Windows here. It will soon change the screen resolution a bit. 8 by 600 now. Now, setup has not started yet, but the setup environment has. So at any given time, you see this fancy background image, which you, by the way, really can't change unless you hack some DLLs, which is not supported. You can press Shift F10 and get a command prompt. Because now you can start to dive into the log files, and they are being moved around during the setup. They are being in 7 different locations depending on what the setup is doing. So sometimes you need to search around a bit to find the right log file. So for example, now if I open the setup act log file, and 2 seconds, I need, sorry, sir? The setup engine, the question is, will that work on Server 2008 as well? The answer is yes, because the setup engine is the same, exactly the same. So that's why I on purpose didn't put a operating system version on this title name for this session. And by the way, the setup is not named Panther. Panther is the logging engine, but that's normally where you end up look into when you troubleshoot in setup, so I thought it was a cool name to have for the session. But yes, it's the same for servers. So here we go. This is the main log file name, setup act log. And again, this file moves around a bit. So nothing fancy so far. It only tries to figure out if we are deploying from a Pixie server or not, and we are not in this case. So I will now click Next, and click Install, which will actually kick off setup exe. Now if I open the log file again, a few more lines been added, and I can actually see, apparently it did kick off setup with a bunch of, well, basically undocumented switches to do things here. But this is what happens. Now, I will sell my soul to the organization behind this software. Click Next, select Custom, a disk, thank you. And now, setup will copy the setup files to the drive, and in just a few seconds, it will actually start to expand the image to the drive, which happens right now. So let us review the drive. Let us do a listing of my C drive, and why don't add in -A to also include hidden files. File not found, meaning empty. Yet it's expanded about 3% right now. Where is the stuff? Yes, sir. No. Let us start this part for a while, shall we? Where is it? E drive. The first drive is the BitLocker partition. The reason it didn't become D was because I have my CD in place. So now if I exit this, go to my E drive, and do a listing, of course now it's expanding my image to this location. So now I can go into the obvious have to type correct. Folder, Panther folder, and now I can review the followed setup log file. For example, search for memory, and I can obviously see that the system has enough memory because 1024 is more than 376, which is the core requirement for setup. But WinP requires 512, so it doesn't help you anything, but still. So if setup, and this has nothing to do which deployment solution you're using. If you're using Ghost, if you're using MDT, if you're using Config Manager, if something happens during the setup phase, and you get an error from the setup, the solution log files will tell you nothing. You need to go into the log file and find the setup ACT log file, because that will have information about what happened to you. Right. What if we want to have our own boot image? Because now I booted on the image that is on the media. Well, I can use the WIKE kit, the deployment tools, to quite quickly create myself a boot image. Copy PE, architecture, either x86 or AMD64, and a folder, TechAd x86. And it will now do a copy of this sample in WIKE and put it in this folder. So if I do a directory listing, I have a winp.wim file. This is winp. If I want to, and let me just verify I have an empty folder here, yeah. I can do image X, I can mount it, read write, the image, the index, and the folder. I can also use the empty mount folder in here, but in this case I'm going to C: mount. So now in my mount folder, I have my opened WIM file. If I wanted to, I can use tools like DISM to inject drivers, hotfixes, packages even for Windows PE. Or if I wanted to, I can just create a folder, tools, add a tool to it. For example, I maybe want to have trace32 in it, so I can review log files, and I can simply copy it to that folder. Done. I can open the registry, inject things. Before committing changes, though, due to a feature in the filter driver, this version of Windows IKE is really sensible for open file handles. So make sure to close all the Explorer windows before committing the changes. Otherwise, you will see that the cleanup process fails. When you've done it about 10 times, you start to remember to close the Explorer windows, but yeah. And you have to type commit, and then the mount folder. All right. Now, I have a WinP image. I could add that to my Pixie server, or I can create a bootable ISO if I want to. So I can use following command, oscd-img, and of course the B switch for boot sector. And I have a boot sector in this folder. Boot sector in this folder. -N for long file name support. ISO, that's the folder I want to create. And then I would specify my TechEd ISO file. What's missing? I need to actually take the file I have, TechEd, copy it or move it, move is quicker, into the ISO sources folder, and by default you have to rename it to boot.wim. Otherwise you will have to change the BCD entry for this record. So I've added a file in there, and now I'm creating my bootable ISO. Now I have an ISO. So now I can revert this machine into a clean snapshot, capture my new custom boot image, take it ISO, and start it. Starting Windows. Do you, by the way, know why you don't always get these nice flying boxes? Sometimes when you start a boot image in Windows 7, you get the Windows Vista look-alike with the green progress bar. If WinP detects a lower screen resolution than 1024 by 768, like you might have on netbooks, it will fall back to the Vista one. So that's sort of a total useless fact still. Now, WinP is started. If I go into the root, I obviously have my tools folder, and I have my trace32 that I added. Let me just adjust the font a little bit. Here we go. Lovely. Sort of reminds you on old days. How would I go about changing the screen resolution in WinP if I wanted to? Because now it's 8 by 600. How would I? Yes, sir. Exactly. This is yours. Try to not kill the other guy. Edit down to 10 XML. That's one option. There are other software available that can change that screen resolution, but they are mostly 32-bit, so they only work in 32-bit WinP. They will never ever work in 64-bit WinP. So what you can do, and I will show you an example. Here we go. This one is good. That's not the one. Have to open the right one. This. You have to create an unattended XML file with the section Windows P. And then you add in the screen resolution. You put that in the root of the boot image, and when in WinP WP init is executed, which is executed by default, it will set the screen resolution to whatever you put in that file. Unless it's higher than the resolution that it's capable of, yes, it can't do that. The question was, will it default back? Yes, it will. It's not like a best effort thing. So now I can ping my server. Yep, I can do a net use, connect to it. Ta-da. Here we go. Let me dive into a folder where I have some operating systems. Here we go. Sources. And I will run setup. How many of you in here think this will work? 1, thank you for the support. It won't. Fails. Because I'm trying to execute 64-bit setup from a 32-bit WinP. Because if I check the architecture in here, you can see it's being set to, this is a 32-bit boot image. Can't execute 64-bit setup. But what I can do, can go up a few folders, go into a 32-bit setup, run setup /install from, specifying the install vim from my 64-bit folder. Now it starts. So yes, you can do cross-platform deployment, but not when using the normal current versions of the deployment solutions. Right. So the setup, as I said, is automated using Anna10XML. It's a text file, but you're not really supposed to use Notepad to edit it. There is an authoring tool called Image Manager, Windows System Image Manager. When you work with that tool, you quickly learn to pay attention to what sections, again, we are adding the different settings in. For example, language settings, like international, region input locale, things like that, can go into like 3 different sections. So you need to know where the setup is. So for example, when is the generalize section being read? At what step in our deployment solution? Yes, sir. Exactly. When you run sysprep to prepare the machine for cloning. So if you have settings that need to go in that, when you do that, they need to go into that section or that path. Where would you normally put disk partitioning? That would be WinP, yeah. Because it would be difficult to do disk partitioning in the very end, right? If you have settings in your image that you want to have applied during deployment, they normally are applied in the specialized path. So the best resource I have found for this, to get some more information, it's actually a good old, let me see if I can navigate and find it here. There was an ebook published a while ago, and I never remember the title of it because you will realize why soon. Here we go. It's on Microsoft Download. Here we go. This is the title, probably the longest title ever. This is a free ebook that explains the differences in setup from XP compared with Windows 7. It's 412 pages long, and it's downloaded as a PDF file directly. Half of the content comes from Windows 7 Resource Kit, and half of the content comes from the normal TechNet library. But this is sort of like a good starting point when you want to learn more about these different passes and things and servicing stacks and things like that. Right. Let me jump into a server. If I want to edit an unattended XML file, I start Image Manager. I select either an image, meaning a WIM file, or preferably a catalog file. The difference is the catalog file is an index of the content in the WIM file, and it opens in about 1 second. If you select a WIM file, it tries to generate the catalog, and that can take like 30 seconds. And guess what? What happens, do you think, if you try to open a 32-bit image on a 64-bit host? It breaks. It's in the release notes of Wike, and everybody reads the release notes, right? You can't do that. Select the catalog file instead. If you need to regenerate the catalog file because you added stuff into it, you need to do that on a 32-bit OS, and then copy the catalog file back to your deployment server. Because when we are running on an R2, we are on a 64-bit platform. So I open a catalog file. And as you can see, I have an answer file in here, completely empty. Let's open one that is more complete. Here we go. For example, here I have added in some offline servicing. I have configured this answer file to add drivers from this path and every folder in it. So most deployment solutions running setup, they do the following. They have a script of some sort, figuring out what hardware you have, copying the drivers locally, and then they simply tell setup, hey, go ahead and inject those drivers for me. Thank you. Some solutions, they use this directly to inject stuff. Specialized phase, this is where you have the normal customizations that is related to, for example, adding a computer name and things like that. But when you are adding stuff in here, for example, I want to partition my drive. Down here, I will create a partition. When you right-click, you can see that you can only add this to the first pass, which makes sense. Some of the other guys, like the language settings, can be added to multiple passes, as you can see in number 4 and 7. So again, you need to pay attention. Luckily, you don't have to deal with those files that much, because most deployment solutions, they work as follows. And especially the Microsoft ones. What they do is that they provide a template on the server. And then they copy that template locally. And then they have a script or executable that will update the local copy. So normally there is also a process before all this that is gathering what to inject dynamically into the file. So they try to avoid having things statically in the unattended XML file. They provide you with a good template and inject the right components underneath. Have a few questions in the tweet deck I would like to answer before continuing here. Is performance similar to physical hard drive when working on a VHD? Absolutely yes. Has been some vast research on that topic. It's like this little difference. Sometimes it's not even measurable. Does UEFI change anything with boot or setup? Yes, it does, because it actually is one partition more. That's something that Microsoft is now adding in additional support for in MDT 2012. It's possible to get to work with MDT 2010, but you need to do some adjustments in the way you're partitioning drives. There was a really good thread on TechNet about a year ago. So if you search for the keywords MDT and UEFI, you'll find it. Let me see. When you offline service Windows 7 images, are the patches actually installed offline, or are they just set up to run when the system boots? Most updates are being installed, but drivers, for example, they are being staged, being present, and then the local plug-and-play service will actually install them later on. When will beta of MDT 2010 be available? It was supposed to be available for TechEd, but it's a few weeks delayed, so in 2-3 weeks' time, hopefully. All right. So, offline servicing. In the image, I showed you how you can add instructions to the setup file to add components like drivers during setup. I can also go in and add packages this way. So to understand how all this goes together, you need to learn how the component-based servicing stack works in Windows. And the best resources I have found, let me skip this for a while and show this. Is actually an old white paper from Windows Vista, from the Windows Vista performance team. You may not believe they were around, but they were. They actually laid a foundation for Windows 7. So it's an old article. It's from 2008, but this is simply the best summary I have seen explaining in short terms how the different components work together. Really good white paper. If you want to go in depth, if you go back to Microsoft Downloads and search for CBS, component-based servicing, you will find another old document, the Windows Deployment Error Diagnostics Guide. 99% of this is still valid for Windows 7. So this is a good reading if you want to know every possible error message you might get and what the reasons might be behind it. All right. So, I told you about the setup ACT log file, but there are a few additional log files that you might have to dive into when troubleshooting, and we'll review the second one from the bottom in a while here. That's the one we use for troubleshoot device drivers. So, When you start to work with the different deployment solutions that you have, you will find that they in turn will provide you with additional logging. Because no matter if you're using the free ones, they both create something called sequences, right? That will do a lot of things before and after calling setup. And one of the benefits of using these solutions is that we can apply and add in something called server-side logging. By simply changing a little bit of the ruling in the process, we can get real-time monitoring of our deployments server-side. So we don't have to be on the client to troubleshoot. So this is light touch. What about Config Manager? It's already enabled. You can dive into the reports in Config Manager. You can review the status messages. But even more, if you do have them integrated together, you can actually configure them to get additional logging as well. Because these scripts will work together with Config Manager as well. Almost. Let me show you that script. Which I put somewhere. This is the script responsible for copying log files and activate real-time logging. When you do light touch deployments, the user ID variable, the user password variable or property, and the user domain property is always set. In Config Manager deployments, they are not. The code in Config Manager, the scripts that sets those variables, is this code right here. That's the code setting the variables. But as you can see, it never gets there. Because this code tells them they have to be different than blank, otherwise they are not set. So if you are using Config Manager and you want to enable the additional real-time logging from MDT for the MDT-specific components, you need to do the following. You need to go into the rules file that you have, and that will be your settings package in Config Manager. And you need to add user ID equals whatever. User password, whatever. And user domain, whatever. As long as they are different from blank. Because now it will jump to the code that will set them to the correct value in Config Manager. And it will use the network access account to set those values. And then you're good. So, sort of a trick to get this one running. Now, what about device drivers? I would argue and say that technicians deploying Windows 7, apart from applications, this is normally where you spend some time, figuring out what drivers are being injected and why. And first of all, in Windows 7, we have a new version of DirectX, DirectX 11, meaning in DirectX 10, it was Vista. And sometimes when you deploy a Windows 7 machine, you may see things like display driver, something, this. If you see this on a Windows 7 box, because sometimes you do, this is a Vista driver, basically. Try to see if there is an update available. So it says 1.1 instead. That's for Windows 7. Right. So, what's the process of injecting drivers? Well, depending on your solution, different things happen. If you're using Config Manager to deploy Windows, there is a script or an executable actually that will copy the correct drivers locally, depending on your configuration, and then they will actually call DISM to inject them during WinP. That's Config Manager. MDT Light Touch always runs setup, even when you're deploying a custom image. So, and I should add a third line here. So with Light Touch, oops, we still have the same here. Depending on your configuration, it will copy drivers locally. It will always copy, but it will copy different things depending on how you configure MDT. They are not using DISM. They are using an unattended XML with a offline servicing section in it, the path I showed you before. And then it will be installed. So how do we troubleshoot this? Well, first of all, if the driver is not copied locally, there really is no point of troubleshooting number 2 and number 3. So we need to simply check, is the driver there? So normally you would add a pause into the sequence, and you would simply go down and look in the folder and see if the correct driver was actually, in fact, copied at all. Then DISM will inject them, and DISM might fail. Why? Anyone experienced this? I have, a few have, yeah. Why? Exactly. The drivers is being extracted into the scratch space. And WinP scratch space by default is 32 megs. NVIDIA graphics driver is 80. And again, difficult to take an 80 meg driver and try to fit in a 32 meg buffer. So for Light Touch, we simply increase the buffer. And that's a property on the deployment chair. Do we have to yes, sir? You can also move the temp directory to the C drive. What do you think Config Manager does? They do exactly that. So they took a different approach. The MDT team, Light Touch, they added a property on the deployment share so that we can increase the scratch space. Config Manager actually took a sort of close to nicer approach at least, and simply set the temp variable to the C drive, or where your local drive is. Because if you don't have enough space there for your driver, you have problem as is. So this is how we deal with it. So troubleshooting, yes, we can check the DISM log file. We can check the CBS log file. In the Light Touch case, we can check every one of those. Plus, do you remember the name? The setup log file, the core one? Setup act, yes. Because what we will see, you will actually see setup exe calling DISM to do the offline servicing from the unattended XML file. So, all right. We verified the drivers actually were injected correctly into the store. What's the point with the store, by the way? What's the point of Windows 7 having a driver store? XP didn't have one. What's the beauty of having one? Yes, sir?
Non-admins can install hardware.
Exactly. A normal user can now install the device. Because as long as you as an admin make sure the driver is staged into the driver store, it's considered to be trusted. And the local plug-and-play service will install it if a user pops in the device. Yes, sir? It's also much easier to get drivers. Absolutely. Yeah, that's correct. But still, what it really means to us is that it's easier nowadays to have a user being still a local user. And it's easier for us as admins because we have somewhere to stage the drivers. We can do it offline. We can even do it online. We can use PnP util to do it online. We can use dp-inst to do it online, driver installation framework component. Or we can use DISM to do it offline, or setup to do it offline. So we do all that. It's injected into the driver store. And yet, when we look into the device manager, we have an exclamation mark. Or we find that the wrong driver is there. How do we troubleshoot this? For both scenarios, the same. Check this log file. It will tell you why. So, let me flip over here and give you an example. I did not mean to open that in Trace, sorry. One of the few log files that is actually better to open up in Notepad. All right. Let me adjust the font here. Here we go. Here is an example of a driver being injected. And in this case, Windows searched the driver store, found one matching driver. Do you think there is any question about what driver that was actually installed? No, it would be that one. But what if we have more than one? 2, 3, 4, 5. Let me find another example. Bad example. A good example. Here we go. Found 2. Selecting best. All right. You can see from right here which one that it's the best. 2 drivers, we see them both. Which one was the best? Bottom or top? Top one was better because the ranking score was lower, and lower means better. The ranking score is being built from the driver. The first 2 characters is the signing type. And this was an inbox driver, and when low is the lowest possible, the best value, 00 is a pretty good value. Otherwise, it had to be like minus. So both the drivers has 0 in the signing type. The next 2 is how feature complete the driver is. And this is a Microsoft driver having a really bad value because FF is pretty high on a hex string. So you will often see that a third-party vendor driver will have a lower score on these two characters because they are normally better. You can think of this, say, HP has a printer with 5 trays and it can fax and it can make coffee. The Microsoft driver can probably only print from the 5 trays, whereas the vendor driver can actually print and fax and make coffee. More feature complete, having a lower value. But for both these guys, even that value was the same. So the difference was now the last 4. This driver had 0003. The other driver had 1004. So that's where they were different. This is how well it's matching the plug-and-play ID. So if you go to Device Manager, go to Device, this is obviously a more specific value than this. And in this case, one of the drivers had a better match than the other. And what you sometimes run into, not often, thankfully, you sometimes need to make a driver better. I was working with a customer in the UK. They had bought a batch of new Fujitsu Siemens machines. And the network card had revision number 3, but their driver had revision number 5. So they would fall back and use an inbox driver, which didn't work. And we thought it would be easier to change the driver than to change the hardware, and we didn't want to wait until the vendor actually released a new drive. But what happens when we change a single byte in an INF file? Yes, sir. You break the signing, yeah. And now we have a bad signing, meaning on 32-bit operating systems, it will be really the last selection ever. On 64-bit ones, it won't even work. So what do we need to do to fix it? Sign it ourselves. Create a code signing certificate and sign it. Install that as a trusted root certificate on your machine, in your image, and you're good. Luckily, this is like the super exception, but somewhere, keep it in your head. If you run into this, if you need to make a change, or if you can't find a signed driver, because that happens, you can actually sign it yourself. And now it works again. All right. So, final piece on device drivers. The beauty of the driver store, not only is it helping us as admins in terms of injecting drivers and things, but it also allows us, and this has been around since the Vista days, but we can actually, using group policy, configuring it, we can set policies to either allow or prevent specific classes of devices, or why not allow or prevent specific device IDs. You don't need to put superglue in the USB contacts anymore to prevent people from using them. You can just set a policy. Don't allow this. All right. Some related resources. On my blog, which is Deployment Research, you can find about 35 different videos that you can download or view directly, totally related to deployment content. That's all I do. I will remind you guys to please fill in the evals. You too can win a cup or a Kinect. So thank you for taking your time, and have a great continuing TechEd. Thank you.